Alright, welcome, Felcha, to Random Thoughts from County Antrim here in County Antrim, Michigan, in the U.S.A. on July the 11th, 2021. And my name is David McDonnell, and this is my half hour of telling stories, some yarns, historical information, and of course my random thoughts. And you're going to get some of that, a couple of those tonight, because I'm going to tell you a few stories from history that are triggered by my random thoughts. Now, the big news in the international scene this week is that President Biden announced that the United States is removing all of its troops from Afghanistan by the end of August. So it's only 6 weeks away. There won't be any more United States military personnel in Afghanistan. As a reminder, we entered Afghanistan. The United States Army invaded Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001. That's almost 20 years ago. That means there are some men and women, young men and women in Afghanistan today who were not born when we first invaded Afghanistan. And I've also heard there's some military personnel in Afghanistan today whose mother or father were in the military in Afghanistan a decade or so ago. That's how long we've been in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not going to comment much about Afghanistan, but the announcement just triggered a couple of thoughts in my head. A couple of random thoughts, and so I just wanted you to know, when you hear these random thoughts, what triggered it in my brain. Now, I used to be a volunteer. I spent many hours at a YMCA camp that's not far from here, just down the road. And there was a guy who worked at the camp for many years, many summers, and he did odd jobs, mainly driving the van or doing errands or this and that. And between you and me, he wasn't particularly good at his job, but what he also did is he played the fiddle and he sang songs. So we would often lead songs in the dining hall at mealtime or around a campfire later in the evening. In fact, after several decades of this, the camp director finally got around to changing his job title, and he became known as the Director of Frivolity. And of course, any camp for kids needs a director of frivolity. Now, one of the songs, one of the songs he sang had very simple lyrics, and it was sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. And I talked about that song several podcasts ago when I was speaking about the Ullans language, the language originating in the lowlands of Scotland, still spoken there a little bit. Still spoken in Northern Ireland to a degree. But in that language is where the song Auld Lang Syne comes from. But the lyrics to the song, it's to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, but the lyrics are, "We're here because we're here." So the song, if you'll excuse my bad singing voice, is essentially, we're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. Again, excuse my singing voice, but that's the song. We're here because we're here. Now, when I first heard him sing that, I just thought it was one of the silliest songs I had ever heard. And of course, there's nothing wrong with being silly, especially at a camp for kids. As an aside, my favorite comedy group of all time is Monty Python, who are irreverent and witty and innovative, but most of the time they're just plain silly. And that's why I loved them. After singing, I need a cup of coffee. I sip on my coffee. So I thought that song was silly, and I was surprised to learn not too long ago when and where those lyrics originated. And it's not from the imagination of someone who wanted to sing a silly song, but the The lyrics to that song originated with British soldiers in the First World War. And the lyrics, when you understand the context, are not silly at all. They're actually quite poignant, quite profound. And those simple lyrics tell you more about World War I than any historian could. So how did World War I start? Why were all the countries of Europe and elsewhere fighting each other? Well, to an extent it's complicated, but to an extent it really isn't. If you want the details, I highly recommend you read Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. It goes into it in great detail, understandable detail. But the short answer of why is simply this, and that is that the rulers and the government leaders of Europe were old men, and they were fully versed and expert in the geopolitical realities of 19th century Europe. They knew, or at least they thought they knew, how to maneuver their countries around international affairs, including war, in a way that would benefit their country, or at least benefit their position within the country. 19th century men. The problem, of course, is they were not in the 19th century. It was the 20th century. And it was an era in which the leaders of Europe just didn't understand. They couldn't even comprehend. One could not start a war in the 20th century and maneuver an army around a little bit and fight a decisive battle and then go home. Not with 20th century artillery or machine guns or high-accuracy rifles. And not with universal conscription that existed in Europe at the time. As a European leader, you figured you could put millions of men on the battlefield with modern weaponry and achieve tremendous results in a short period of time. And they never stopped to think that their neighbor, could do the exact same thing. So the countries of Europe declared war on each other, each for a reason that they thought, or at least the leaders thought, would be in their best interest. And war was declared in the summer of 1914. And then within weeks, there were millions of men on the battlefields of Europe, shooting and bombing each other. And the European leaders thought the war would be over by Christmas 1914. But it continued through 1915, 1916, 1917, and within a month or so of Christmas of 1918. Before it ended, there were about 20 million people had died from that war. Now, if you had asked a soldier, an ordinary soldier, in 1914, why they were there, on either side of the war, why are you here, you might ask. And he likely would have said, I'm here because my country needs me. And if you asked a new soldier coming to the front any time thereafter, he probably would have said the same thing. Or he might have said, I can't stay home while everyone else in the country is fighting. You certainly would not have received from any ordinary soldier on any side any kind of discernible war aim other than that. But after being in the trenches for a while, for months, which grew into years, you're likely, if you ask the soldier the same question, you would likely get an entirely different answer. The answer would likely be something like, I'm here to see things through so I can go home. And the more fatalistic of them might have simply said, I'm here because I'm here. And that became the lyrics to this song. It was sung by British soldiers in the war. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. Sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. Now, there actually is a recording of the song done in 1916. And you could find it on YouTube if you're as curious as I am. And it was recorded as part of an interview of Edward Dwyer. Edward Dwyer was born in 1895 to Irish parents. He was born in England to Irish parents. And he enlisted when the war started, and he was only 16 years old. And he, very shortly thereafter, he won the Victoria Cross for bravery in one of the early war battles. But he hurt his back somewhere along the line. He was sent back to England for recuperation in 1916. And he was interviewed by someone who had a very early recording device for 1916. He was interviewed, and his interview was recorded. And he talked about the trenches. He talked about what food was like. He talked about what soldiers did in between battles. And he talked about how they passed the time. And it was only about a six-minute interview. But he said one of the things soldiers did to pass the time was to sing songs. And these were songs often with made-up lyrics to very familiar tunes. And as a sample, he sang, with perhaps a voice worse than mine. He sang the song, "We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here." And I think those lyrics just explain better than anything I've ever encountered why soldiers were in the First World War. Why so many Europeans were killing and dying at that time. Now, Afghanistan, just to show you my random way my brain works. Afghanistan just made me think about that song. The United States invaded Afghanistan for very, very specific reasons. It had nothing to do with the Taliban. The Taliban are just, everyone agrees, very despicable people who do despicable things. And they've been doing that in Afghanistan since the 1990s. And people around the world saw what they were doing in the 1990s and thought it deplorable. But no one, and certainly not any Americans that I ever heard, thought that we needed to invade Afghanistan to stop the Taliban. What changed was 9/11, September 11, 2001, where we quickly identified Osama bin Laden as the culprit and his group, Al-Qaeda, as responsible for 9/11, the 9/11 attacks. And we knew that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were in Afghanistan. Now, they weren't Afghans, but the Taliban in Afghanistan were providing them with safe haven. So less than a month after 9/11, we sent the American Army to Afghanistan with a mission: destroy Al-Qaeda, kill Osama bin Laden. President Bush articulated that mission very, very well in 2001. And there weren't many people here who disagreed. It had nothing, again, to do with the Taliban. We fought the Taliban only because they were in our way in achieving our mission: killing bin Laden and destroying Al-Qaeda. Now, it took some time. I can't even tell you how long it was, or when there was a, quote, mission accomplished in this regard, but we eventually destroyed Al-Qaeda as a force in Afghanistan. But we kind of lost sight of the rest of the mission because bin Laden just proved difficult to find and to kill. And frankly, the Bush administration kind of lost interest. It changed its focus to other things, the axis of evil, starting with Iraq, and we invaded Iraq. And that kind of took our focus away from finding and killing Osama bin Laden. In fact, it took us 10 years. He was killed by Navy SEALs in, when was it? May 2nd, 2011. It's a little over 10 years ago. Joe Biden was vice president at the time, and he was in the White House when, in the Situation Room, when the Navy SEALs killed bin Laden. And no doubt to Biden, this was mission accomplished. We did what we set out to do. It took us 10 years, but we did what we set out to do in Afghanistan. And it was time to get out. But Biden was the number 2 guy at the time, and the number 1 guy, President Obama. I think he wanted to get out too, but I think he was afraid of what would happen if the United States pulled out of Afghanistan too quickly. As I recall, there was another guy somewhere between Obama and Biden who was president, and that other guy campaigned on a platform, among other things, of getting out of Afghanistan, but he never got around to doing it. And so now that Biden is the number 1 guy, he says it's time to pull us out. All right, well, one can argue, obviously, with sound reasoning and good faith that we should stay or we should go. And I think I'm of belief it's the right thing to do, but I certainly understand people's concerns and arguments that it shouldn't, and that we shouldn't. And I have nothing but respect for the men and women who served in Afghanistan, and whatever they say is worthy of listening to and respecting. But whatever you do, please, don't listen to politicians who never fought in Afghanistan, or did not send their sons or their daughters to Afghanistan. I'm thinking of people like Lindsey Graham, who are criticizing the withdrawal now, and not because they think the withdrawal is wrong. They criticize the withdrawal because they think it makes them look strong, makes them more likely to win an election, or more likely to get airtime on television, and thus they become or remain relevant. So guys like Lindsey Graham just kind of remind me of people who got the world into the First World War. There were men whose brains were in the 19th century, not realizing that they were living in the 20th century. And guys like Graham just are yet another generation of people whose brains are in the 20th century, not realizing we live in the 21st century. So if you want to know why we're in Afghanistan today, I think the answer is simply we're there because we're there. And whatever may happen in Afghanistan in the months or years to come, we're not there because we're not there. All you need to know from the lyrics of what I used to think was a silly song. All right, I'm going to continue with some randomness. One more sip of coffee and I'll continue with my randomness. It's another story. It's different, but maybe related. I'll let you judge. And it's about the expression, live and let live. You've heard that expression. It's not real commonly used, but you've heard that expression. Sort of like obla-dee, obla-da. It's kind of an expression that means mind your own business. I don't care what you do, but don't you tell me what to do. Live and let live. Now, again, you don't hear the expression often. Where I've heard it most, or most recently, even though I shouldn't say most recently, but where I've heard it more as part of culture, is sort of a derivation of that expression. It was used by Ian Fleming in one of his James Bond books, where he wrote Live and Let Die. And of course the theme song for that was written and sung by Paul McCartney, Live and Let Die. So it's a variation of that theme. But live and let live is also a name given to a frequent but very illegal practice in the trenches of World War I. And we all have the images of the trenches and the trench warfare. You had trenches on one side with an army and trenches on the other side with an army. You had the land in between. Trenches may have only been 100 meters apart. And you had the land in between, which was called no man's land. And that land in between was filled with craters from artillery fire and barbed wire. And one side or the other would start a charge, and they'd go across up and over the trench and across no man's land to to be met by rifle fire and artillery fire and machine gun fire. Incredible carnage. Whenever one side or the other went over the top into no man's land. Now that image is quite accurate, actually, but it was not. The war was not a 7 days a week, 365-day a year affair. The attacks into no man's land occurred whenever one side or the other launched an offensive. An offensive might be ordered, and it covered a relatively narrow tract of land. It may have been a 5-mile wide offensive involving 1 million men going over the top. But it was a relative, when I say 5-mile stretch, that's a relatively small stretch of land when you think about the fact that the trenches began, north end was on the English Channel, and the south end of the trench line was Switzerland. And it wasn't a straight line. The trenches, if you look at a map, kind of went like, like this. They're about a 500-mile stretch of trenches in which you had Germans on one side and French and English on the other. So when there was not, when there was an offensive, it was a very horrific, intense affair involving millions of men and, frankly, hundreds of thousands, sometimes even 1 million casualties. But if you weren't involved in that offensive, if the other almost 500-mile stretch of trench lines, it was much quieter from time to time. There may be occasional sniper fire, occasional artillery bombardment. One side or the other may launch a raid. But it wasn't the non-stop fighting that occurred during a major offensive. Now, the soldiers in these trenches just lived a terrible lifestyle. I mean, the trench was filled with mud. There were rats all over the place. The men slept, either slept in the mud or they slept inside holes dug out in the trenches, so they slept underground in a very primitive bunker. Just terrible conditions that these guys lived in. And what happened from time to time was kind of a totally unofficial and actually spontaneous and totally illegal ceasefire. It was simply one man in a trench deciding not to shoot a soldier he saw in his gun sight on the other side of no man's land. Even if he had a clear shot, he might not fire. And the thought was, if I don't shoot him, he and his colleagues may not shoot me. And if others followed that practice, you might have long lines of trenches in which no one was shooting at each other. And if you did this and you saw a young, eager guy next to you getting ready to shoot someone, you may stop him and say, live and let live. Tell him, don't fire. And that's what the soldiers referred to this practice, live and let live. Now, this practice just drove the senior officers of both sides just crazy. Because they would order raids, they would order firing, they would do anything to keep the men firing. When the men's inclinations, again, if they were not involved in going on a major offensive or defending the other side against the other side's offensive, if you weren't in that situation, you would just as soon stay put, live and let live. Because it just made your life easier and increased the probabilities that someday you would be able to go home. I'm going to give you one extreme example of this that I read about some time ago. They were German on the trench line, kind of Germans on one side and British were on the other, and a German snuck out of his trench line, kind of crawled through no man's land to get reasonably close to the British trench. And when he did that, he got close enough, he took a rock and threw a rock inside the British trench. Now, that rock had a note wrapped around it. And to paraphrase, because I don't know the exact words, but the essence of the note was that our officers are very upset with us because we are not fighting. And we are ordered to begin fighting tomorrow. But we will aim high. And we will give you a warning before the firing starts. Now, the next day, the British obviously were on alert because they heard that from that note that there was going to be firing the next day. And sometime that next day, they heard a whistle blow, which turned out to be the warning. And the whistle was from the German side. And then all of a sudden, there was firing, pretty intense firing. But the British ducked down in their trenches. And what followed was about a half hour or so of very intense firing by the Germans towards the British side, where the British were ducked down. And not a single British soldier was hurt. And after the firing stopped, both sides went back to live and let live. And I think this is another example of soldiers being soldiers, soldiers being there because they're there. The German and the British politicians may have had reasons for going to war, but the German and the British soldier just wanted the war to be over so they could go home. Live and let live. We're here because we're here. And we don't want to be here because we don't want to be here. So anyway, those are my random thoughts for the day on this, what do we got? July 11. Triggered again by Joe Biden's recent announcement, which you agree with, disagree with. Just think about the people that are fighting that war when you debate that issue. So take a look at my website, clandonald.net, and send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Like and share my Facebook page or my YouTube videos. I'm going to do some more postings this week, both on the website and Facebook, because I have some announcements to make about festivals and appearances in 2021. There's going to be a few, I think. And I'm looking forward to them because they have been few and far between. I haven't spoken to a public audience since when? I think it was February 2020. So that's the end of the podcast. For now, we'll see you next week.